Okay, hello, it's good to see you. It's an incredibly gloomy day, so apologies if this looks like I'm sitting in a cave. But today I'm going to be showing my process for modeling a humanoid character in Blender. But first, I wanted to say thank you and hello and just start this video off with a moment of gratitude. I just got approved for the first phase or module of the YouTube Partner Program, which means you should now see a thanks button somewhere down there probably. And of course, there's no pressure for you to do anything or buy anything, but if you want to support this channel and you want to do more than just watching videos, which is perfect, honestly, you can use that. I wanted to say thank you and welcome all the friends who found this channel in the past month especially. It's been a big month and it's been really nice. It's been really nice to know that we're starting to build this community around the channel, which I've talked in the past before is harder to do for me on YouTube than it is on Twitch. And so it's nice to see that here, and just wanted to say thanks. Also, I wanted to try something because I saw this on a video I was watching last week and I didn't see it in time to try it on my last video. But if I say, like this video, did something happen? Did the little button light up? Oh man, it's such a cute feature and it's a little silly, but I love it. I hope it worked. I'm gonna watch and I'm gonna see if it worked. Now we're gonna get into the actual video, modeling a character in Blender. And the thing about humanoid characters is that I've made a good number of them, not as much as someone who does 3D modeling for their job, but I made a good dozen at least humanoid characters, and it never gets any easier. This was extremely hard for me to the point where I was a little worried about making this video because I feel like I don't know what I'm doing, so why should I tell other people how to do it? In the end, I did come up with what I think is a pretty cute character, and even though I struggled a lot, I found a process that gets me through modeling the character from start to finish, and I think that's worth sharing. So this video, I believe, to keep it from getting too long, is just going to be the head and face area. And then I think we'll do the rest of the body together in another video, just to keep it from being an hour long. All in all, this process did take me multiple hours over. I didn't do it all at once. I did an hour here, an hour there, over the course of a week. So it'll be trimmed down and edited, but I'm going to touch on all the parts of the head and the face that I modeled, how I sort of created the edges that you need to get the detail in certain places and not other places, and just sort of my philosophy for 3D modeling, which I also want to point out, a little disclaimer, the way that I do 3D has pretty much always been this low poly stylized modeling process, and I do the textures by unwrapping the UVs onto blocks of color or gradients. I picked up this little technique from developers like Rebecca on the Ooblets team, or Joyce at Minions Art, who is an excellent source of information. Would highly recommend her, especially because she actively does tutorials. Rebecca does not do tutorials as much because she's running a game dev studio, but there are a couple of blog posts out there that are still really helpful. But I point this out because I don't do realistic sculpting, I don't do painting for the textures, and I don't do a lot of detail in my character models. And this is for two reasons. One, the obvious reason, it's easier and it's quicker. As a person who works on games by herself, I just don't have a lot of time to make every character photorealistic and every game object super detailed. So that's the first reason, but the second reason is important, and that is I like it. I like the style that I've chosen, and I don't just like it for myself because it's easier and because I'm more comfortable with it, but I like it in games I'm playing. Like Ooblets, for example, one of the cutest games to ever exist. Very simple art style, very fun to look at, color is used very well, and that's the kind of thing that I like to look at, and so that's the kind of thing that I want to make. So with all that, we're going to get into it, in Blender with our default cube to start. Like I mentioned in the intro and in a previous game dev video, I had a really hard time getting the face right on this model, so I restarted it about 4 or 5 times. I can't exactly remember, and I think the secret to not doing what I did is just to accept that it's going to look pretty bad before it starts to look okay. Like with any art, it goes through a rough phase as you're building it up, and you start to think, why did I ever do this? This looks terrible. I should just quit and throw this in the trash. But if you push through that part, it might not come out looking perfectly, but usually it comes out looking fine. And that's what you want to do. Keep making things that look fine until you build up the skills to make something that looks great. The first thing is to get the shape of the head blocked in. I tried a couple of my attempts to start with a sphere of some sort. A UV sphere usually works better for something like this, but in the end it's the trusty default cube that worked for me. I love the default cube. I also recommend using a mirror modifier for anything symmetrical, especially characters, and they're almost always symmetrical, at least up until the end if you have any details that are different on one side. It's easy to add the mirror modifier, turn on clipping so the vertices in the middle merge together, and then you just have to worry about one side of the character as you're working. I've also turned on matte cap, which is a rendering option that lets you see a material on the object that shows you kind of how light is going to hit the surface. You can see any weird pinchy bits with the matte cap on without needing to set up a whole lit scene. You have to have the rendering in solid mode, I believe, and then there's a drop down at the top right to pick the matte cap option that you want. And the actual shape of the head will depend on the look you're going for. I wanted a very cute, almost chibi style character with a large, round head, so I kept that in mind and just added a little bit more geometry to the default cube to start and round things out. And let's talk a moment about loop cuts. Loop cuts are a crutch that beginners use way too much. And it's okay, I was there once too. I still do this sometimes if I'm not being thoughtful about my work. And frankly, even now, I wouldn't call clean topology my best skill, but I have learned a lot, and I'm learning more every day. You only want to do a loop cut if you actually need that extra geometry all the way around the object. As we get into the face details, we're gonna get to a point where we do not want to add loop cuts because we only want that extra detail on the front of the head where the face is. And adding loops on loops on loops just creates a very dense mesh with vertices all the way around, which is usually not what we want. Once I have the rough shape in for the head, I started cutting out the eyes. And usually I do a little bit more detail work on the head shape, get some more geometry built in, but I went for the eyes pretty early. And I think it helped a little bit because it started to help me break up the face into its different parts. And whenever possible, you want the edges of your mesh to sort of follow the shape of the mesh. And keep this in mind if you're animating, if you're going to be bending this geometry, you want to create edges in places that's going to make it easy to bend. So for the eyes, you typically want the edges to flow around the eyes. To get these in, sometimes I'll just use a knife tool to cut out an eye shape. For this one, I used inset to get a smaller face on the front side of the head, and then I deleted that interface and then added edges through the middle so I could round it out a little bit more. And every time I add a new detail, I make sure to flip the face around in 3D, have a look at it from each side. Especially if you're new to 3D modeling, it can be easy to forget that this isn't a drawing that you view from the front. It has volume, and as you turn it, you might see that something's got a little bit out of place. Might see, the face is not flat, even though in pictures it can look flat. The eyes don't point exactly the same way. They're sort of pointing outward from their place, which is around the head. The head is round, And a lot of this seems obvious if you look at, a finished 3D model, but it's important to keep all this in mind as you're building up these shapes. And sometimes I use a reference for my 3D models, and sometimes I don't. For this one, I mostly pulled up cute low poly characters on Pinterest, and then I also pulled up some references specifically for topology that I'll talk about in a little bit. After getting the eyes roughly in the place they go. I didn't do too much detail work on these. I started to define the nose. I think noses are the hardest for me. I'm not really sure why. They're also the hardest for me to draw, which is a weird coincidence that they're both, 2D and 3D. Noses are difficult. For this one, I used another inset, and then I just pulled the tip of the nose outward to start defining the shape. And as I mentioned, I was also looking at topology references to try and figure out how the loops should flow around the nose area and the mouth. And I noticed that a lot of the examples that I saw that looked like they had decent topology did have like a loop of faces going around the nose and around the mouth. So I added a little bit more geometry to make sure I could find that shape. Next, we're cutting in the shape of the mouth. For this, I kind of cut a square in where the mouth goes, lining up the middle with the loop that was already running horizontally through the lower part of the face. And this way I can keep the corner of the mouth as sort of the connection point where all these edges meet, because that's where a lot of points meet in reality too. And looking at how things move and connect in reality can help you understand how to do it in 3D. I did some more tweaking, getting the edges of the cheeks rounded out, and then I moved on to the lips. For me, lips always look bad. Maybe I just need to practice lips a whole bunch of times. Maybe that's a challenge I can set for myself. The part I find most difficult, that I don't really know how to do this yet, is giving the lips a volume, which they have. Lips have a certain volume to them. Without making them look like duck lips. And I didn't really do that here. They look pretty ducky to me. But another pro tip is that things that look kind of bad when you're modeling will start to look a little bit better once you add texture, once it starts to look like the final object. That doesn't really help me feel better about it right now, but it's part of the process to go through this kind of weird phase, and then as you add the final colors and the final shapes, hopefully it starts to look a little bit better. After that, I revisited the overall head shape, trying to get the shape of the jaw refined a little bit more. The way that faces sit on the head is a little strange, but I once watched a drawing tutorial where the artist described the face as being like a mask that is put on the front of the head. And this helped me draw them on paper better, but it also helped me in 3D by imagining that rounded plane that the mask of the face sits on. There's this point where it meets the side of the head that is not totally round usually. If you look at your own face, you can kind of see this, and that helps me with head shape to think about it that way. Next, I cut a hole out for the neck and extruded down. This part took a lot of tweaking as well. I redid it a few times. There's a certain curve where the neck meets the back of the head, and it took me some time to get the positioning and the angle right. And looking back, I think the way to line this up is to look at, you start at the chin, follow the jaw back, which is at an angle. It's not straight usually, unless you've stylized it to be straight. But if you follow the jaw back, you can kind of see the curve where the head meets the neck is at the point where the jaw line meets. Next up, ears. You would not believe how many of my character models have not had ears simply because I got so deep into the modeling process that I forgot people have ears. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because my real life ears are just very small, but I frequently forget to add ears. You can get really detailed with these if you want to. Ears are kind of weird and they have a lot of little bits in them, but I always try my best to keep it simple. I'm not looking that closely at ears. And to add the ears to the head, I usually find some faces on the side, or if I want a more realistic ear, sometimes I might cut faces out in the correct shape, and then I extrude them outward and build up the shape from there. I gave this character pointed ears just to imbue a little bit of fantasy into the style. I haven't developed any lore. I don't know if she's an elf or a gnome or something else, but I just added the pointy ears and we'll figure it out later. If you do want to add more realistic detail to your ears, I'm not the best teacher for that, but my suggestion is to use the knife tool to cut in the shapes of like the little bits in there that curve around the inside of the ear. And then once you have those shapes cut into the mesh, then worry about connecting them to the rest of the mesh in a way that makes sense. Because trying to move the vertices that you have, I feel like usually doesn't create the right flow of edges, and it's easier to just put in the lines you need from the beginning and connect them up later. And I only talked about this briefly in this video, but when modeling for games and animation, you want to keep an eye on the topology of your mesh, the way that the vertices connect to each other and where the edges are and things like that. A rule of thumb is to try and use quads wherever possible and to avoid having more than 4 edges connected to one vertex if you can. Generally speaking, if you have messy topology, it can create strange bending, pinching, sometimes artifacts in the mesh, because when you render something, everything gets broken down into triangles. Quads can pretty safely be broken down into triangles, but polygons with more edges can have kind of unpredictable results. As I said, topology is not my strongest subject, but it's important to learn, especially if you're animating or doing something with your model other than just like rendering it out. Like if you're giving it to someone else, especially, you want to make sure that the lines are clean and that it's gonna do what they need it to do. But once I have all the pieces in place, I just go around and tweak the shapes, and sometimes I will add like a subdivide or something to smooth things out. I didn't do that on this character, at least not yet, because I just want to work with the simplest form of the mesh, and then if I'm adding a lot of detail at once, I want to do that at the very end. And I used to start with the body of a character because it was less intimidating, but I found that it's usually better to get the difficult stuff out of the way first, because then the rest of it is a breeze. I also noticed that I didn't fill in the faces for the eyes or refine the shape of the eyes until later, and this is because I typically build the eyes into the character mesh. Some people will use a separate object that they can rotate freely, especially if they're doing eye tracking. I prefer a different strategy where I animate with blend shapes, but I'll put in a little clip of how I finish off the eyes later. Basically, I grab that round loop and I extrude inward, forming each shape as I go. And I ripped this strategy straight from Minion's art. One of her tutorials is pretty helpful. She has a lot of low poly stylized stuff that I've learned a lot from. So I form the whites of the eyes first, and then the iris if I have one, and then the pupil before merging the vertices at the center to close up the shape. And I do this nearer the end because it's easier for me to see the shapes if I have the texture applied. So I wait until I have the texture set up, and then I can see all these colors as I go and get a good feel for how the pupil looks compared to everything else and things like that. I do a similar process for the eyebrows, where I will select some faces around the eyes where the eyebrows will be. I might slide them around a little bit, but then I pretty much mark them out just by adding a texture to those faces, and that's it. Sometimes, rarely, I will create separate objects for the eyebrows so that they can be animated independently if I'm doing facial expressions, for example, but I don't think I have that in the plans for this character, so this one I'm keeping it simple. The eyebrows are sort of just drawn on, and that's the face. I'll put in a little screenshot of what it looks like when it's all done and textured. You would have already seen this in my last devlog video, but of course we didn't quite get there in this one. Keep an eye out for the next modeling video if you want to see the rest of the process. but pat yourself on the back because the face is the hardest part. It gets easier from here. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button and like this video. It helps me out. It helps other people find and enjoy this video too. Also, I don't think I even introduced myself properly in this one. I'm Savalian. I make videos about games, development, and creativity. I'll be back soon with another video, and I hope to see you there. Okay, bye-bye.